Sarah had always felt drawn to abandoned places, the kind of locations where whispers filled the air and secrets lay buried in the silence. But none of her previous explorations had prepared her for this. A mall, long forgotten by time, nestled quietly on the outskirts of the city, had drawn her and her friends into its depths. It looked like any other mall that had fallen victim to the slow decline of retail. Empty storefronts, shattered windows, and a quiet that was too deep to be comforting. But as the group wandered through its corridors, they soon discovered that this was no ordinary abandoned mall. There was something darker here, something that watched from the shadows, something that had not been forgotten, but rather locked away. The story of the forgotten floor had been whispered about by locals. Some said it had been sealed off after the disappearances. Others said it had never existed in the first place. But as Sarah stood in front of the decaying mall entrance, something gnawed at her gut. She had to know what lay inside. What she didn't know was that the mall was hungry, and it had been waiting for someone to come back. The air inside the mall was cold and stale, the kind of oppressive chill that made Sarah's skin crawl. The smell of mildew hung heavy in the air, and every footstep echoed like a warning in the vast emptiness. She and her 3 friends, Daniel, Jess, and Mike, wandered through the mall with flashlights in hand, their beams cutting through the darkness. It was hard to believe this place had ever been bustling with life. The walls, once adorned with posters for the hottest fashion trends, were now peeling. The colors faded and chipped like an old photograph left in the sun. Sarah felt a strange sense of unease as they passed by empty stores, their once prominent signs now barely visible, smudged with the grime of years of neglect. "What happened here?" Jess asked, her voice unnervingly soft. Her flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something, moving at the edge of her vision. It was probably just the light, but something about it didn't sit right. "No idea," Mike replied, his voice tense. "Maybe the owner just abandoned it. The place looks like it's been shut down for decades." Sarah didn't answer. She was too focused on the strange sensation that had taken root in her chest, the feeling that something was watching them. But when she turned around to look, she saw nothing but shadows. "Let's check out the food court," Daniel suggested, pushing open a door that led to the old mall's main gathering area. The floor was cracked and uneven, the remnants of overturned tables and chairs scattered about like forgotten relics. The air was thicker here, and the faint smell of rot hung in the atmosphere. As they made their way through the food court, they found something that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. An elevator, standing still in the center of the room. It was the only functional one in the entire mall, and it looked out of place, its sleek metal door gleaming despite the dust and grime covering everything else. "Anyone else think it's weird that an elevator works in a place like this?" Jess asked, eyeing the elevator warily. "I don't know," Mike said, eyeing it with skepticism. "Maybe it's just one of those old maintenance elevators. People use them when the regular ones are broken." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The elevator doors seemed too clean, too new, like they were waiting. Before Sarah could protest, Daniel pressed the button to call the elevator. The doors opened smoothly, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Let's go check it out," Daniel said with a grin, clearly excited by the mystery. The others hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won out and they stepped inside. The elevator was unnervingly quiet, with none of the usual creaks or sounds you'd expect from an old lift. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and before anyone could stop him, Daniel pressed the button for the ground floor. But the elevator didn't stop at the ground floor. Instead, it moved upward, passing the second and third floors without slowing down. What's going on?" Mike asked, his voice rising in pitch. "This isn't right." Sarah's heart began to pound. The elevator was still rising, and it was moving faster now. They all exchanged nervous glances as the elevator slowed to a stop. The door opened with a gentle chime, revealing a dark corridor stretching far beyond what they could see. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no flickering lights, no sounds from the rest of the mall, just an unsettling stillness. "Should we get out?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. But Sarah felt an irresistible pull to step forward. She had to know. What was up there? What was waiting for them? It was as if something was calling her, drawing her in, and the others followed hesitantly behind her. The corridor was long and narrow, the walls lined with doors that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The air grew heavier with each step, the silence pressing down on them like a physical weight. And then they saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door slightly ajar. They approached cautiously, Sarah leading the way. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. As they stepped inside, their flashlights illuminated. A scene frozen in time. The furniture was old, dusty couches, wooden shelves filled with tarnished trophies, and books strewn about the floor. But it wasn't the room's disarray that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was the mannequins. They were arranged around the room, standing still, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at nothing. But the worst part? They were in strange positions, twisted and contorted, as if they had been placed there by something unnatural. "What the hell is this?" Mike muttered, stepping forward. "I don't like this," Jess whispered, pulling back. "We should go." But Sarah couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on a single mannequin sitting in a chair in the far corner. Its face, though frozen in, a permanent smile seemed wrong. The eyes were too real, the skin too smooth. It looked like a person, like someone who had been turned into a mannequin. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind them. "Shit!" Daniel yelled, rushing to the door and pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lights in the room flickered and the air seemed to grow colder, suffocating them with a deep, unnatural chill. Suddenly, they heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the mannequins. "You shouldn't have." "Come," the voice whispered, echoing off the walls. The mannequins began to move, their joints cracking as they jerked to life. Their eyes locked onto the group and a low hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's heart raced as she backed away, her breath shallow and panicked. "No! No! No! No!" she cried out, her voice high-pitched and frantic. One of the mannequins stepped forward. It was taller than the rest, its face twisted in a grotesque mockery of a smile. It reached out with stiff, jerky movements, and as its fingers brushed Sarah's arm, she felt a coldness seep into her skin, spreading like ice through her veins. The mannequin spoke again, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of something scraping against metal. "Now you're ours." The room seemed to close in on them, the walls bending, distorting, and the mannequins moving faster, their bodies snapping into unnatural positions, twisting their limbs in ways that no human could. The last thing Sarah heard before everything went black was her own scream, echoing into the void. Sarah's world went black as the last remnants of consciousness slipped from her grasp. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, but when her eyes fluttered open, the first thing she noticed was the absence of light. The eerie glow from their flashlights had disappeared, leaving the room cold and suffocating. Her body felt heavy, as if the weight of the world had fallen onto her chest. Panic surged through her as she tried to move, but her limbs felt frozen in place, as though they were bound by invisible ropes. Her breaths came out in short, shallow gasps. The mannequin's face was etched into her mind. Its eyes, wide and unblinking, filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, a light flickered from somewhere beyond her field of vision. Her eyes snapped to it, her heart racing as her body finally regained movement. She could move again, but her limbs felt weak and uncoordinated. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself off the cold floor, wincing at the sharp ache in her knees. The flickering light grew steadier, revealing the grotesque mannequins that surrounded them. They were still in the same disturbing poses, their bodies twisted in ways that defied logic. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Sarah blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from her mind. "Sarah?" A voice croaked from somewhere in the darkness. It was Jess. Sarah's heart sank as she saw Jess's pale face illuminated by the dim light, her eyes wide with terror. "Where are we? What happened?" Sarah tried to speak, but found her voice lost in her throat. The room, no, the entire floor, seemed to be alive, the walls pulsating like a living organism. As her vision cleared, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Doors. Doors lined the walls, but they weren't normal doors. They were warped and deformed, some of them half open, others sealed shut with thick rusted chains. The mannequins had come to life, but they hadn't moved. They stood in place, their once still bodies now vibrating with an eerie energy that seemed to emanate from the very air. Sarah's gaze drifted to the mannequin closest to her. Its eyes were no longer vacant. Instead, they glowed with a sinister, unearthly light. Suddenly, the mannequin's mouth opened, and the same voice that had whispered earlier echoed in Sarah's mind. "The floor is not just a place, it is a memory." The words sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. She staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The mannequins seemed to be watching them, their eyes following every movement. We need to get out of here," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. "Now!" Sarah tried to move, but her feet wouldn't obey her. It was like the floor was pulling her down. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the sense of being trapped. It was then that Sarah understood the true horror of the forgotten floor. It wasn't just abandoned. It was cursed. A place of forgotten memories, twisted by whatever had once been here. Suddenly, the mannequin that had spoken took a step toward them. Its mouth opened wider, and the words came again, this time clearer. "You should never have come. This floor was sealed for a reason." The room trembled as if the entire building was shaking, and Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shift. The mannequins started to move, jerking into motion like marionettes being controlled by unseen strings. They walked toward the group with unnatural speed, their faces twisted in horrifying grins, their eyes glowing with malice. "Run!" Mike shouted, his voice hoarse. The group bolted toward the only exit they could see, the elevator. But as they reached it, the doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. It was as if the building itself had sealed them inside. "No, not again!" Daniel screamed, pounding his fists against the elevator doors, but they wouldn't budge. The mannequins closed, in their footsteps echoing in the silence. They were relentless, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they surrounded the group. Jess turned to Sarah, her face pale with terror. "What's happening? Why can't we escape?" Before Sarah could answer, one of the mannequins reached out and touched Jess. Her body jerked violently, and her scream echoed through the room. Sarah watched in horror as Jess's form began to contort, her body twisting in ways that should have been impossible. The mannequin's touch had warped her, transforming her into one of them. "No!" Sarah cried, rushing forward, but Mike grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It's too late!" Mike shouted. "We have to leave her!" But it was already too late. Jess's body went limp, her features frozen in a grotesque imitation of her former self. She had become a mannequin, her eyes wide open, her mouth frozen in an expression of pure terror. The air grew colder, and the mannequins seemed to smile. As the group tried to comprehend what had just happened, Sarah's mind raced. What had they unleashed? Why had they been brought here? The mannequins were more than just lifeless statues. They were manifestations of something far darker, something that had been locked away in the forgotten depths of the mall. The walls began to shift, the hallway stretching further and further into an abyss. It was as though the entire floor was a labyrinth, constantly shifting, never allowing them to escape. Then, the mannequin that had spoken before, tall and towering, stepped forward again. It was no longer standing still. It walked slowly toward them, its eyes glowing brighter, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated. But this time, its voice held a deep, chilling resonance. "You were chosen. You are part of the memory. Now." The mannequin's face split open, revealing a gaping maw that seemed to consume the light. From within it, something shifted. An ancient presence, something older than the mall itself, something that had been imprisoned here for decades. Sarah's heart raced as the truth began to settle in. The mannequins weren't just victims. They were the guardians of something far worse, an ancient force that had been sealed away, and now it was free. Suddenly the room shook violently. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the floor beneath them split open, revealing a vast pit that seemed to stretch on forever. The mannequins moved faster now, closing in on the group, their eyes glowing brighter with each passing moment. "You will join the forgotten," the mannequin intoned, its voice growing louder, more urgent. Sarah's blood ran cold as she turned to look at her friends. Mike and Daniel were frozen in place, their faces pale with fear. There was no way out, no escape. The floor was closing in on them, and they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The last thing Sarah heard was the sound of the mannequin's voice echoing in her mind. "You will never leave." Weeks later, the abandoned mall was demolished. The wrecking crew found nothing unusual, just the crumbling remains of an old structure. But the locals knew the truth. They had heard the stories of the forgotten floor, the place that had been sealed away long ago. No one dared speak of it again, and yet, somewhere deep within the wreckage, something stirred. A faint whisper echoed through the broken walls. "The floor is waiting, and it will never be forgotten." The clock struck midnight, its sharp chimes echoing through the empty streets like a warning. The city, usually a buzz of activity, had long since fallen silent. Streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows on the pavement. The hum of the world seemed muted, as though it too was waiting for something. Something dark, something terrible. Inside the Ravenwood Mall, the lights were dim, casting long shadows that stretched across empty aisles. It had always been quiet, at this time of night, but tonight something felt different. The usual hum of the escalators, the rustle of shopping bags, and the soft murmur of late-night shoppers were absent. Only the soft creak of the building settling echoed through the cavernous space. Lena shifted her weight uneasily as she walked past the security desk, where the guard, an elderly man named Mr. Hicks, sat with his head down. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, too slow. As she approached, she noticed the unsettling stillness of the air around him. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his eyes were wide open, glazed over, staring blankly at the ceiling. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She had been working late at the convenience store on the ground floor, a job she barely tolerated, but the extra hours helped pay the bills. When she had taken the night shift, she had expected the usual routine. A few lost souls wandering the mall, browsing aimlessly. Maybe a few couples sneaking into the food court to steal a quiet moment. But tonight, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. She forced herself to look away from Mr. Hicks. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her keys, walking past the rows of empty stores. Each storefront was like a hollowed-out shell, its signs dull and lifeless. The faint smell of antiseptic mingled with something else, something metallic, something almost sickly sweet, lingering in the air. Her eyes kept darting from one end of the hallway to the other. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she saw nothing but darkness. But there was something in that darkness that seemed to watch her, waiting for the right moment to strike. She made her way toward the escalators. Something was pulling her up, something whispering in the corners of her mind. The top floor of the mall was rarely visited after dark. The luxury stores were always locked up tight, their polished windows gleaming in the moonlight. But tonight, Lena felt an inexplicable urge to go up. She didn't even know why. She hesitated for a moment at the base of the escalator, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, something strange happened. The lights flickered for a split second, the soft hum of the escalators stopped, and a cold gust of air swept through the lobby. Lena shivered and stepped onto the moving stairs, her legs heavy with reluctance. With each step she took, the feeling grew stronger, like something invisible was pulling her upward. She reached the top floor, her pulse racing, her stomach knotting in unease. The moment she stepped off the escalator, she was greeted by a chilling silence that hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. Lena looked around. there was no one. Here. The floor was vast, and the stores that once housed the latest fashion trends were now empty, their windows dark and lifeless. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Then her eyes caught sight of a single store that was different. It was tucked away at the far end of the floor, its entrance dimly lit by a flickering neon sign that read, "Sophie's Corner Shop." Curiosity gnawed at her. She had never noticed this shop before, and she had worked here for over a year. She knew every store in this mall, every corner, every hallway. But this store had always been hidden, as if it had never been there at all. Something deep in her gut told her to turn away, to leave before it was too late. But her feet moved before she could even think. She was drawn to the store, the neon sign flickering in the darkness like a beacon. As she stepped closer, she noticed the store's windows were dusty, the glass smudged with years of neglect. Inside, the shelves were stacked with old trinkets and items that looked as though they belonged in a time long past. There were antique dolls with porcelain faces that seemed too lifelike, tarnished jewelry, faded books with tattered covers, and boxes piled high with forgotten objects. Lena pushed the door open, and it creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing through the empty floor. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air felt different, thicker, colder. The faintest sound of a child's laughter echoed in the distance, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. She moved deeper into the shop, her eyes scanning the shelves. A chill ran down her spine as she picked up an old music box, its surface chipped and worn. She turned the handle, and the soft tune began to play, a melody that sounded both haunting and familiar. The more she listened, the more she felt as though she was being transported to another time, another place, somewhere far, far away. But then the laughter came again, louder this time. It was coming from somewhere in the back of the store. Lena froze. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift around her, closing in. The laughter became more insistent, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Slowly, she turned around, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the doorway of a small back room, was a child. The child was pale, almost ghostly, with wide eyes that seemed too big for her face. She was dressed in a frilly white dress, her hair tied up in pigtails. She didn't speak. She just stood there watching Lena, her eyes wide and unblinking. The child raised one hand slowly, pointing toward the back room. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew instinctively that she shouldn't go any further, but something was compelling her, something she couldn't explain. She took a hesitant step forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The child didn't move, her eyes never leaving Lena's face. And then, without warning, the door to the back room slammed shut. The sound of the child's laughter grew louder, more frantic, and the entire store seemed to shake. Lena's pulse quickened as she spun around to leave, but the door to the shop slammed shut, trapping her inside. The walls seemed to close in on her, the shelves around her trembling, the music box still playing its eerie tune. Lena's head spun as the store seemed to shift, the lights flickering again, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The child was gone, but she could still hear the laughter, echoing in the darkness, growing louder with every passing second. She turned toward the back room, her body moving on its own accord. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to turn and run, but her feet carried her forward, step by reluctant step. As she reached the door, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. Lena slowly reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and then, with a deep breath, she twisted it. The door swung open to reveal nothing but darkness. But deep inside, she could feel something watching her, something waiting. Lena stepped into the blackness, the door slamming shut behind her. The air inside the back room was suffocating. It was as if the space had never been touched by light. Every inch of it seemed steeped in darkness, the kind of darkness that wraps around you like a suffocating fog. Lena's breath became shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out, feeling along the walls, but there was nothing. No light switch, no warmth. Nothing but an oppressive cold that seeped into her bones. Then she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the corner of the room. It was small, hunched over, its back turned to her. Lena's blood ran cold as she recognized the figure. It was the child, but something was wrong. The child's movements were slow, unnatural, as though it was being controlled by some unseen force. Its head jerked backward suddenly, and Lena gasped as she saw its face. Its eyes were no longer wide and innocent. They were black, pools of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The child's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, far too wide for any human to ever achieve. It let out a low, guttural laugh, one that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. Lena stumbled backward, but the child didn't move. Instead, it started to chant, the words strange and foreign, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows dancing around her like living creatures. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble. The store, the entire mall, was alive, and she was trapped inside it. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as the child's laughter reverberated throughout the room. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and a cold sweat dripped down her spine. The child's mouth stretched even wider, now grotesque. A chilling grin painted across its face as its dark eyes bore into her soul. The room felt alive, alive with the malice of something ancient and terrible. Lena turned to flee, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had turned to quicksand, and the shadows around her had solidified into thick, unyielding chains. Panic clawed at her chest, but she could do nothing. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic chanting, growing louder, pulsing like a heartbeat, and then it stopped. Silence. The child, no longer a child, stood there, its smile twitching, the eyes now blacker than the deepest abyss. It opened its mouth wide, and from within, a sound emerged. A guttural, inhuman growl that was so deep it shook the walls. It wasn't just sound. It was a vibration, an echo that resonated in Lena's bones, in her very soul. The room around her began to distort. The walls closed in, the shelves began to shift, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. She could feel the presence of something far worse than the child, something ancient, something that had waited for years, decades, centuries even, locked within the heart of the mall. With a sudden, violent jerk, Lena managed to break free from the floor's grip. She bolted toward the door, but as her hand grasped the doorknob, it slipped from her grasp. It felt like it was coated in ice and the door didn't budge. Desperation clawed at her throat as she pounded on it with her fists. Her mind was consumed with one thought. Escape. You can't leave. The voice was like a whisper in her ear, but it wasn't coming from the child. It came from everywhere. It was the voice of the mall itself. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if the building was alive, shifting, twisting, folding in on itself. The walls stretched and contracted like they had a life of their own. Lena backed away, terrified, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned and ran toward the back of the room. It wasn't just the room that was closing in on her. It was the entire mall. Everything she had known was slowly unraveling, collapsing into this horrifying, nightmarish realm that existed between the real world and something far worse. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she ran down a narrow hallway, barely visible, in the pitch black. As she stumbled forward, her mind raced. Why was she here? Why had she come to this cursed store? Suddenly, the hall stretched impossibly long, its walls narrowing as though closing her in. The lights flickered, and an overwhelming, suffocating darkness swallowed her whole. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her surroundings grew more grotesque by the second. The walls warped, twisting, and dripping with an inky black substance that had a sickening, acrid odor. From the darkness ahead, a soft whisper came, a voice low and haunting like the wind passing through dry leaves. This place was never meant for you. Lena's stomach turned and she wanted to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was caught in the grip of something far older than her, something that had slumbered in the shadows for centuries, waiting for someone to come along, a victim to feed on, to torment, the midnight shopper. It was then that she remembered the rumors, the legends of the mall's forbidden fourth floor, the one that didn't show up on any directory, the one hidden behind locked doors. That was the real reason she felt compelled to climb the escalator. That was why she had been drawn to this store. And now, there was no going back. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. The evil lurking here wasn't a figment of her imagination. It was ancient, it was hungry, and it had already set its sights on her. The walls around her closed in tighter as she ran, her breath coming in desperate gasps. She could hear the sound of something behind her, something heavy and dragging. It was getting closer. With every step, the coldness in the air grew more suffocating, more oppressive. The black, gooey substance from the walls began to drip from the ceiling, pooling at her feet like thick oil. Lena finally reached the end of the hallway, a massive rusted iron door standing before her. She reached for the handle, but it was cold to the touch, and the metal felt alive, pulsing with an eerie energy. The voice came again, this time sharper, more forceful. "You can't hide from what's already here." With trembling hands, Lena threw the door open and stepped into the room beyond. It was vast, far too large for the space it should have occupied. The room was dark, save for a single, flickering light high in the corner, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The air was thick, suffocating, and the faint smell of decay and rot filled her nostrils. In the center of the room was an altar. Made of stone, it looked ancient, and it was covered in strange symbols that pulsed with an unnatural, sickly glow. Around the altar were hundreds of small, tarnished objects, dolls, figurines, and items that seemed to be placed in offerings. But it wasn't the altar that made Lena's blood run cold. It was the figure standing in the corner, its eyes glowing. Faintly in the dark, it was the child. Or at least, it had once been a child. Now its form was twisted, its limbs elongated and gnarled, its skin pale and cracked. The dark eyes that had once been full of innocence were now empty, like hollow sockets. The child slowly turned toward Lena, its mouth stretching wide in that grotesque grin. It raised a thin, bony hand and pointed directly at her, as if calling her closer. "Join us." Lena's heart stopped in her chest. She knew what this was. This wasn't just a haunted mall. It wasn't just a cursed store. The mall itself had been built upon the bones of something ancient, something malevolent, and the spirits trapped within had waited for someone, anyone, to stumble into their grasp. The child's voice echoed, now in unison with others, whispering in Lena's mind, "This is your home now." Suddenly, the entire room began to shake, the walls rattling as if the building itself was alive, breathing, and it had begun to wake. The altar began to glow brighter, the symbols shifting and twisting into shapes that didn't belong in this world. Shadows seemed to reach out, clawing toward Lena, trying to pull her into the darkness. Lena's instincts kicked in, and she turned to run. But as she reached the door, it slammed shut, and the room plunged into complete darkness. Lena felt the pull of something strong, something unrelenting. The darkness closed in around her, swallowing everything. The child's laughter rang in her ears, but it wasn't just laughter. It was the sound of every lost soul that had ever wandered into this cursed place, now forever trapped, condemned, to a life of torment and darkness. The last thing Lena felt was the cold, clammy fingers of the child's hand on her shoulder, pulling her into the black void. The next morning, the mall was still. The lights flickered back on. The familiar hum of escalators and mall sounds returned. But the Ravenwood Mall was no longer the same. The forgotten fourth floor had vanished from the directory once again. The old security guard, Mr. Hicks, would later be found dead in his chair, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if he had seen something far beyond this world. But Lena? She was gone, vanished without a trace. Her name was eventually marked as a missing person. Her disappearance, like so many others, would remain unsolved, buried beneath the mall's secretive, cursed history. And the child's laughter, it still echoed in the forgotten corners of the mall, waiting for the next shopper foolish enough to wander into its grasp. Late one evening, a few days after the city's newest mall had opened, strange rumors began to swirl around it. The construction had been quick, almost too quick. People spoke of an abandoned site beneath the building, where something ancient and long forgotten had been buried. Locals whispered about a curse, stories of strange happenings that the workers refused to talk about. But when the first few days of business went smoothly, those rumors faded into the background. No one paid attention until the disappearances started. Lena, a young woman new to the city, was a part-time employee at the mall's coffee shop. She'd heard the whispers, of course, but she never thought much about them. That was until she stayed late one evening, trying to finish a shift after hours. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Lena felt a cold chill pass over her. At first, it was just the usual draft from the air conditioning. But then the whispers started, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Lena looked around, uneasy, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Lena had always been a night owl, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with an ominous energy, as if the mall itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. After she had closed the coffee shop for the night, she headed toward the employee exit. The lights flickered above her, casting long, twisting shadows that made the mall feel unfamiliar. There was something wrong about the place after dark. It felt hollow, abandoned, despite the bustling crowds during the day. As Lena walked through the darkened mall, she noticed something strange. The usual sounds of bustling shoppers and overhead announcements had gone silent. The mall felt too quiet, as if the air had been sucked out of the space. She passed by the escalators leading to the second floor and stopped. There, at the far end of the mall, stood an old, rusted door. She had never seen it before. It was hidden away, tucked behind a row of dusty shelves. The door seemed to beckon her, drawing her in with a sense of unease, like a distant memory tugging at her mind. Her heart raced as she approached, the silence around her growing heavier. She tried the door handle. It was locked. But just as she stepped back, the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting her in. Lena hesitated for a moment, but then stepped through the threshold. She had no idea why she was so drawn to this place. Something told her it wasn't meant to be found, but curiosity won out. As she stepped into the dark corridor beyond, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She stumbled forward, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes tried to adjust to the low light. The walls here were different, old, cracked, and stained with what looked like dried blood. There were no more shiny marble floors or pristine signs for stores. Instead, the walls were lined with peeling paint, and the ceiling was low, like the mall had been built on top of something ancient. Lena could hear faint whispers again, and this time they were louder, almost intelligible. She strained to listen, but the words didn't make sense. A low hum filled the air, like the sound of an old television with static. The deeper she ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. At the end of the hall, she found another door. This one was ornate, decorated with strange symbols she couldn't recognize. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The moment she touched it, a cold surge of energy shot through her body, and she heard a faint growling whisper. "Don't open it." Lena froze. It felt like the very air around her was watching, waiting, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had come. She had no choice. She had to know what was behind that door. The door creaked open, revealing a massive, dimly lit room. It was the size of a theater, but the walls were lined with old shelves filled with strange, forgotten relics. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. The smell of decay was overwhelming, as if the room had been untouched for decades. Lena took a cautious step inside, her eyes scanning the room. The silence was deafening. There were no footsteps, no sounds of breathing, just the unsettling hum of something unseen. As she ventured further into the room, she saw something strange. A row of mannequins, standing still, frozen in time. But as she approached, she realized they weren't mannequins at all. They were people, or at least they had once been. Their bodies were stiff, their faces locked in expressions of sheer terror. They were dressed in tattered clothing, their skin pale and wrinkled with age. Some of their eyes were wide open, staring into the void, while others were closed, frozen in eternal sleep. Lena took another step forward, and as she did, one of the mannequins, no, one of the people, moved. A single eye cracked open, following her every move. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She staggered back, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Get out of here." The voice came from behind her, low and guttural, sending chills down her spine. She whipped around, but the room was still empty. The mannequins had not moved. Only the silent, oppressive darkness stared back at her. Lena's mind raced. What was happening here? Why were these people frozen in place, and who or what had whispered to her? She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, something tugged at her arm. It was cold, icy cold, and it pulled her back into the room. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The mall had swallowed her whole. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, skeletal shape with dark eyes and a cloak made of shifting shadows. Its face was a blur, a shifting mass of distortion. But its eyes, those eyes, were filled with nothing but endless hunger. It spoke, its voice low and echoing in the darkness. "You should not have come." The shadow raised its hand, and Lena felt the air around her grow thick. The walls closed in on her, suffocating her. Panic surged through her chest as she gasped for breath. Her vision began to blur, and everything around her seemed to twist, bend, and break. Suddenly, a loud crack filled the air and Lena was thrown to the ground. The room spun wildly, and she saw flashes of the past, visions of the mall when it was first built, of people walking through the halls, laughing, shopping, completely unaware of the curse beneath their feet. The shadowy figure loomed over her, its face now clear, a horrifying combination of human and something far worse. Its mouth opened wide and a sound like 1,000 whispers poured out surrounding her. The silence. It consumes you. Lena screamed again, this time louder, but her voice was swallowed by the unyielding silence. As Lena lay on the cold floor, the last remnants of her strength drained away, she realized with a horrifying clarity what had happened. The mall wasn't built on top of something. It was built around it. The curse had been here long before the mall, long before the city. This place had been designed to trap anyone who dared venture too far. The curse wasn't just of the land. It was in the walls, in the very air she breathed. And now Lena was a part of it. Her body froze, her breath faltering, as her vision began to fade into darkness. The last thing she heard was the whispers, the endless haunting whispers of the forgotten ones. Welcome to the silence. The next morning, the mall was as vibrant and bustling as ever. Shoppers walked through the brightly lit corridors, oblivious to the curse lurking beneath their feet. But beneath the polished floors and shining glass, the forgotten mall of silence continued to whisper. Waiting, watching, and anyone who dared to venture too deep would never be seen again.